the intersectionality of patriarchal sources, which I've summarized as the 4 M's: men, markets, military, and mullahs. With the result, it pushes Pakistan at the bottom of global gender indices and benchmarks. From the beginning of the independence of Pakistan, they were vying for federalism and promoting federalism and power at the center. Feminist perspective has been that women and vulnerable classes are not treated as equal economic subjects in state economic policies. The Benazir Income Support Program, it is proof that when you invest even symbolically in women's rights or women's economic possibilities, potential and empowerment, it yields all kinds of other empowerment. Women have been used as symbols or crutches of both kinds of military rules that we've seen in Pakistan. Feminists have called populism dangerous and gendered always. And currently we are undergoing hybridity of all kinds. Several women of the All India Muslim League participated in the movement for freedom from British colonial rule, and also from then the partition from India, which included Fatma Jinnah, Begum Rana Liaquat Ali, Begum Abdullah Haroon. You had Begum Hadayatullah, Jahan Ara Shahnawaz, Waqarun Nissa, Begum Tasadduq Hussain. I'm Afia Shehrbano Zia. I'm a Pakistani feminist scholar, and I've been an activist with the collective called the Women's Action Forum for nearly 30 years since I was a student. My book, Faith and Feminism in Pakistan, deals with the intersectionality of patriarchal sources, which I've summarized as the 4 M's: men, markets, military, and mullahs or clerics. And I've documented how these collude to oppose the rights and equality of women and minorities, and they thwart democracy and liberal and or secular progress in the country. With the result, it pushes Pakistan at the bottom of global gender indices and benchmarks. So today I'm going to offer an overview of the women's movements in Pakistan, and I've divided these according to different eras, historical eras. And this is all from my standpoint, and it's not an exhaustive history by any means or an exhaustive her story, but it's really just to offer a macro assessment. So let me begin with the first slide, which is part 1. So by men, markets, military, and mullahs, men, number 1, refers to basically state male elites, whether they're politicians or bureaucrats or the military. From the beginning in the independence of Pakistan, they were vying for federalism and promoting federalism and power at the center. It was only when the 18th Amendment to the Constitution was made that this devolution of power opened up the possibilities of provincial autonomies or powers that were shared. At the same time, men in communities, even working class men, who head households, who head jirgas or tribunals, they also assert sexual and economic control over women and minorities. So really it is a reference to patriarchy and how it operates across all classes and all levels. With regard to markets, it's a reference to capitalism, and the feminist perspective has been that women and vulnerable classes are not treated as equal economic subjects in state economic policies. And in fact, one evidence of this is that when you do pro-women policies like the Benazir Income Support Program, it is proof that when you invest even symbolically in women's rights or women's economic possibilities, potential and empowerment, it yields all kinds of other empowerment. So really it's a critique of capitalism. Number 3, I've referenced military hegemony, which is a constant in Pakistan, and women have been used as symbols or crutches of both kinds of military rules that we've seen in Pakistan. One which suggests that it is promoting Islam, and or another that says that it is promoting liberalism. Both kinds have used women as symbols and really not true empowerment. So patriarchal, the feminist opposition to military, and also that it prevented democracy from embedding itself in Pakistan. And lastly, mullahs or clerics who have enabled a Sunni Punjabi majoritarian hegemony in Pakistan. They advocate for unequal gendered roles. Even if they are rights, they are unequal. They have persecuted the Ahmadis using the blasphemy tool, other minorities as well, religious minorities. They advocate separate electorates, and they promote forced conversions in recent times. We've seen a growing trend of that. If we look at the next slide, It offers a timeline of different eras that I mentioned. There's very little Pakistani feminist historiography on the colonial period. Indian feminists have tended to do far more work on that. But there is literature after that particular period. So, for example, if we see in the after independence, there were women who were were part of the freedom movement and the national independence movement of Pakistan in the 40s. But in the 50s and 60s, you'll see women's involvement in the post-colonial restructuring of the state and some social welfare work. In the 70s, we have Cold War imperialist conflict. We have the Bangladesh liberation movement in 1971, where East Pakistan separates and gains its independence from West Pakistan. There is some protest by women over there. They are part of student unions, and of course there was the realization and protests against mass rapes that the state inflicted on Bangladeshi women, and then the subsequent settlements in both wings. And then the Islamic revivalist or the revolution in Iran in 1979, there was a growing realization and collectivism in Pakistan around these regional events. In the 80s and 90s, we have struggles for democracy in Pakistan, in which women come at the forefront. And then there's other influences like globalization, neoliberalism, and we see a growing trend and institutionalizing of growth of NGOs, non-governmental organizations in Pakistan, who start working on women in development. And this is perhaps the richest period of feminist literature being produced by women leaders of these NGOs and scholars who were emergent, who were sort of more radical feminist scholars at this time. In 2000, we have the War on Terror and a literature which Pakistan suffered as the frontline ally to the United States under a military dictator. We have at this period a lot of feminist splits within and women's rights are debated quite a bit over here under post-secularism and kind of the reconstruction of identities. Identity politics is at peak over here. And there's a lot of what I call post-feminist suggestions, recommendations, and ideas and theories at this point that invest a lot in religious agency. And we also saw towards the end of this decade the rise of the #MeToo movement, anti-sexual harassment movement, and a discussion of sexualities that emerges within feminists and is brought to the public sphere. And finally, in the current period, the 2020s onwards, there is what we are undergoing now, and we witness a global resurgence of populism, which has a direct effect on gender. Feminists have called populism dangerous and gendered always. And currently we are undergoing hybridity of all kinds. We've seen not just a military-civil hybrid regime sort of peaking, and enforcing itself and undermining democracy, but we also see piety and neoliberalism and capitalism and military sort of combining quite a bit, and it has a direct gendered impact as well. Now, with regard to the women's movements, the early women's movements, there's really a vibrant early movement in the sense that, as I mentioned, that the women's freedom fighters, several women of the All India Muslim League participated in the movement for freedom from British colonial rule, and also from then the partition from India, which included Fatma Jinnah, Begum Rana Liaquat Ali, Begum Abdullah Haroon, you had Begum Hadayatullah, Jahan Ara Shahnawaz, Waqarun Nissa, Begum Tasadduq Hussain. And in 1948, we have the first legislature of Pakistan, which had two women representatives, Jahan Ara Shahnawaz and Shahista Ikramullah. And at the same time, Begum Rana was very active as not just a freedom fighter, but as the wife to Pakistan's first prime minister. She started the Women's Voluntary Service, which was dedicated to rescue and rehabilitation services. These were very important. It was rescue and rehabilitation of women who were sort of lost on both sides of the border. And Urvashi Batalia has written quite a bit on this from the Indian perspective. We also had the Democratic Women's Association, which was formulated around Marxist principles. So, simultaneously at this time, we had seen several series of Shariat acts replacing colonial laws. And this is historically important because they shifted the dynamics of what legal subjects women were to be, or what legal rights applied to them. So we had Shariat acts in 1937 and 48, in 51 and 1962. And it is important that in 1951, the Shariat Act recognized women's rights to inherit agricultural land. They had the right to inherit land, but agricultural land was always shielded from such rights. And this is interesting because recently there's been a court case that has been heard by Pakistan's first woman Supreme Court judge, Aisha Malik, and she's listened to a case and adjudicated in favor of this inheritance right to a woman who's being denied this because it was falling between colonial laws and the Shariat Acts. And what we see through that, I think it's an important lesson, because what we see through that is how women become subject and have to negotiate, whether it's under colonial laws or it's under Shariat Acts. They have to constantly negotiate. There's no constant absolute rights that women hold over here. It's really precarious and open to interpretation, which perhaps other laws are as well, for other subjects as well. But for women's rights, nothing is stable really. And then there's been a debate of Pakistan, whether it's an Islamic republic or a homeland for Muslims. That debate continues. But one thing is clear is that it was perceived as a modern nation state and not as some revisionist state of Medina, etc. And there was no critique of the paradoxes of modernity at the time. This is a later critique that has emerged. And so progress was quite rapid, particularly for women. And that's why we see today a kind of a nostalgia for a time when women's progress was in light of this post-colonial modernity. So, for example, in 49, there was no question about women not being in public service in the Women's National Guard, Women's Naval Reserve. As I said, Rana Liaquat Ali Khan founded the All Pakistan Women's Association, APWA, which is very important and organization, and made invaluable contributions to welfare, to legal reform, and advocated reserve seats in parliament. We have the Karachi Business and Professional Women's Club established in 1954. And as we've seen, Pakistan's history is littered with military intervention. So in 58, we have General Ayub Khan imposes martial law. And by 1961, recommended by APWA and the United Women's Front, the Muslim Family Law Ordinance extended some of the most progressive rights to women across the Muslim world. Really, other than Tunisia, Pakistan had some of the most progressive rights in this regard, to marriage, to the custody of children, to divorce, and to registration of marriage and divorce. And it is important to point out that from the very beginning, this has triggered a lot of debates. And in the 1962 Shariat Act that followed enabled a kind of it's an interesting dichotomy or an interesting contestation that takes place between two. Almost the contradictions start and the clash is inevitable between these two streams of laws and how they're going to be reconciled. So for example, we have today, I think, some 37 petitions filed against the family laws, the Muslim family laws in the Federal Shariat Court. So and then we have family planning, which was sort of promoted quite aggressively and not always in a very progressive way, because we have, for example, in Bangladesh, we know that there has been forced sterilization as part of the global imposition of contraception, but also a dual-edged right, because giving women bodily rights is a direct form of empowerment, but at the same time, if it is forced on certain populations, that's a repressive means, it's an oppressive means of promoting this. But basically all this to say that we have a period when the collusion already of men, military and Maulvis, we can see it emerging. There are the contradictions are layered in the early years. If we move on to the 1960s and the 1970s, we have in the 1973, for example. So first of all, over here we can see that America becomes Pakistan's ally as negotiated by a military ruler. That's a major decision, and it does affect Pakistan's democracy. It affects Pakistan's conception of what rights are, what kind of vision that we're going to have for gender rights and for democracy and for foreign relations. As I said, 1962, the Shariat Act is passed. In 1965, the sister of the founder, Fatma Jinnah, stood in the elections against General Ayub Khan. So again, quite a visible and political differences between women's representation and what they are representing and military. So and particularly this face-off between gender rights and gender movements, women's movements, and military rulers. This has been a very contentious and sometimes cooperative relationship, and it is worth commenting on. And as I said, in 1971, Bangladesh gains independence from West Pakistan. So the main debate that is then arises over here, if we summarize this first period, it is that, which M should the women's movement strategically ally with? What has been what is the pathway that they should take? And I'm not saying this was conscious at the time. This is in retrospect and analysis. It is important to remember that it wasn't so simple just to pass the family laws because there were elite women behind it, or Appa was a begum. This is a critique that we often get. The fact is there was a lot of clerical pressure against it. And sort of they did have to use their class power. But for example, in 1956, the family law reform was first shelved. They weren't just passed automatically. And there's always been a persistent attempt to refute women's rights. The ulama also refused to sit with women in the Constituent Assembly. We talk about expanding our presence in the assemblies and representation, but it's not a simple, easy path. As if there are no obstacles to it. The ulama also said only parda observing women over the age of 50 should be allowed. And this has also been a constant refrain, including right up to the time of Benazir Bhutto, when the Jamaat-e-Islami raised this whole campaign that a woman cannot be a leader of a woman cannot be head of state of the Muslim world. And all sorts of negotiations and acrobatics and interpretations had to defend this idea. At the same time, the military's support for women's rights at this period defined a paradoxical relationship with the state. And so there's a lot of debate within the women's movement as well on the strategic bounds and the boundaries of using the master's tools to dismantle patriarchy. Can this kind of alliance ever really deliver true democracy and women's rights?